koutou e kai tonu ana, haria mai wā koutou kai ki wā koutou tūru, tara mai. Ka pai, ka pai, ka pai. Tēnā nō rā koutou. Thank you to many of you who have come back from this morning's sessions. That's a good sign. And welcome to those who have just arrived for the afternoon sessions. We know that not everyone has the entire Saturday free to do what they want to do. So welcome, welcome everyone. As you came through, you will have noticed that there are books for sale by McLeod's, and there are some other bits and pieces that have a relevance to our event this week for sale. So do think about purchasing some of those products at the entranceway there. Now, many of you have just enjoyed a nice lunch, and we are able to provide more than cheese and crackers at this event per kindness, the very generous sponsors that we have had. And as I also welcome the people who are watching online, I always want to make a respectful reference to our sponsors, because quite often it's just a very quick run through a list of names. So with all the dignity and elegance that I can muster, I would like to thank these people who made it possible for us not to have to run sausage sizzles. Creative New Zealand, McLeod's Booksellers, One Foundation, Rotorua Trust, tēnā koe Stuart, Te Arawhiti, Te Tatau o Te Aroa, Rotorua Reurua, and as always, Ngāti Whakaue Education Endowment Fund. Well, I'm going to clap. As we draw to the dusk of our event, and by that I mean that it has been going since Sunday afternoon when we had our pōhiri tamate kapua, and it ends this evening with a gala dinner. As we draw to the dusk of our event, it becomes increasingly important to draw your attention to the fact that we have survey papers, which will inform our discussions post-event about how often or even if we have another Kupu Book Festival. So please take that as an urging of you to fill out the survey, which I understand is also available online. I think that's me done for the day. I certainly don't want to steal the thunder of our lovely Mercia, who has been supporting the Kupu Festival throughout the week with her radio program, and I don't want to be taking some of her task. She will introduce our guests. Tēnā koe, Mercia.
Nei rā te mihi kaua atu ki a koe e makoha. O tira tō tātou nei mārei kura o tēnei o a tātou nei huhuinga ara ko Kupu. Ka nui te aroha ki a koe. Tēnā rā e te iwi o tira koutou kai te kāinga me mihi ka tika ki a koutou i tēnei wā. Koutou anō kia hoki mai ki tēnei o a tātou nei huhuinga a Kupu. And for those who are new or have just come to this particular session, a very warm welcome to you this afternoon. I have the privilege of introducing two new manuhiri to our atamira this afternoon. First of all, kia koe Dr. Michael Ross, tēnā koe Mike. Ka tāia e koe a muri te whakamohio atu ki te hunga whakarongo hunga mātaki ko Waikoe. O tira kia koe tākuta Rebecca Kittle, tēnā koe e te hoa. Nō reira, tuatahi mai, this particular kaupapa is around and about imagining decolonisation. It's been quite interesting, even the segue from the previous kōrero with Stacey to this particular moment in time. Because if we look at our reo and we think about who we are as Māori, more often than not we've been in a situation that has had us at te korokoro o te parata, and I'll get Mike to talk about that shortly, where we're at the precipice of trying to find out who we are, trying to find our worth and our belonging in this place. And I say that from a colonised lens, because all my life I've only known Mercia Dawn Marae Yates, now 53 years old, who has had to walk in both worlds confidently. Te korokoro te parata is something that Mike writes about. And I refer back to the parata in the sense that it's a leviathan. And some of you might not know what a leviathan is, but a leviathan is the largest sea creature known to mankind. Some might refer to it as being a mythical creature, of which it is not. We have whakapapa, we have pūrākau, we have pakiwaitara, we have mōteatea that tell us otherwise. They talk of this creature that the waka of Te Arawa sat at the precipice of its mouth as it was about to come to its turmoil. That is exactly what happened. We know this to be true, we know this to be fact, whakapono marika i era kōrero, because our tupuna told us so. So that, I think, is a great way to start our kōrero this afternoon around imagining decolonisation. Nō reira kia koe Mike, tēnā pēr ka tāia koe te whakahua mai, ko Waikoe no hea koe.
Tēnā tātou, pai. Tainui te waka waikato te awa, Ngāti Haua te iwi.
Maybe that way. Go that way.
Oh, kia ora.
Like you're singing at a karaoke bar or something.
Yeah. Waikato tani whārau, he piko he tani wha, he tangata I puta mai I taua awara. Nō reira, tēnei ka mihi atu ki a koutou.
Tēnā koe, Bex.
Kia ora koutou, nei rā te mihi ki a koutou I tēnei rā. After telling Mike to do it. I te taho tōku kraua no ko hukurangi te maunga ko Waiputawa ko Ngāti Porou te iwi, I te taho tōku kuia no Ngāpuhi. Kia ora koutou.
Tēnā kōrua. Just while we were having a bit of a lunch break, just to kind of ease it up a little bit, because it's really hard when you're actually sitting. Everyone thinks I can interview really well, but I'm only crossing my legs so my knees don't shake, so kia ora rā tātou. But just over the break, we had a connection. What do Māori do best? We make connections. We try and figure out, where are you from? How do I relate to you? How do we make this conversation matter? And it matters to us every single time because we have connections. So just over the break, Becky and I had a bit of a kōrero about my son. And one of the things I didn't talk about with Stacey was whilst my children had a break in their reo schooling life, they were always Māori first and foremost. So he's followed a path of becoming an architecture. And kei te hiahia te mihi atu ki a koe, Becky, because you've also got a background in urban design. So when we look at writers and where they come from and who they are, these are often the backbone foundations that create the opportunity and space for them to be able to be writers as well. Going to carry on now with you, Mike, and refer back to te korokoro o te parata. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that?
In my thinking about colonisation, it has been so pervasive in our society. And I wanted to think about it or find a Maori metaphor to sort of start the story, and partly because I thought that might be more interesting for Maori readers. And so selecting the korokoro or parata was the idea that it's this huge sea monster on the ocean, and it happened to be Te Arawa Waka. But the idea that, or people that go out on the ocean, it doesn't matter how well you plan when you're on a long journey, there's going to come rough times, and so it's not trying to evade that rough water. It's being prepared to take on that rough water, and so a part of the story is understanding our history and the journey that we're on. We have been at the precipice of losing who we are as a people, but the resilience is what are the people who are still in the waka, and ko tātou tērā. And so although we tell the story, you have to tell the story and the history to understand how we got into this space, but it's also a story of hope that in the turbulent times that we've been through, we're still paddling and we're still going forward. So, koia tāku.
Tēnā koe, and I think as I scan the room today and probably think of our whānau that are watching online, so much of that kōrero resonates with us. And I wasn't merely saying that I am Mercia Dormaraia Yates and I only know who I am because I am who I am. The colonised past has produced this being. We're all products of our past. And I look forward to dreaming of a better future for our children and our mokopuna. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the way in which you imagine this too, please, Bex.
Oh, kia ora. Yeah, I guess it might be helpful just to talk a little bit about where the book came from in that respect. So I went and studied overseas for 10 years in the UK, and I remember coming back to Aotearoa and thinking, oh, things will have changed a little bit for Māori. And there were some changes, right? There were lots of treaty settlements going through and a little bit more money in certain iwi and things like that. But inherently it was still pretty much the same kōrero, the same hara, the same hurt that people were talking about, and it was just a bit disappointing to have gone away for 10 years and come back and feel the same. So I remember having a kōrero with Mike and Amanda and the others in the book. So I just want to acknowledge Bianca, the amazing Dr. Moana Jackson, of course, Jenny and Ocean. So we kind of got together and we developed a project called Imagining Decolonised Cities. So my particular interest is in the way in which we design our world to embody Māori identities, essentially. And people were talking about decolonisation, but it felt like it kind of sat in the air. You know, sort of this very esoteric term that people were throwing around, and it was like, well, what does that actually mean? I can't say I'm all the way there to really understanding still. Like, it's such a multifaceted and complex thing, but the project was really born out of, okay, what does decolonisation mean for our cities? What are the physical implications? Hence, the kōrero with your son around architecture and the implications for decolonisation for that. And so we did a project out in Rotorua with Ngāti Toa, and we took a whole lot of rangatahi out on a bus trip, and we started talking about colonisation. And they were like, oh, what's colonisation? And I was just so surprised that rangatahi, you know, secondary school kids in Rotorua, which is has quite a high Māori population, were still not being really taught what that word meant. we weren't even onto the notion of decolonisation. So the book was sort of a mini act of decolonisation in some ways, in that we were trying to create something. And I know most people have said that they've been writing for Māori, but actually I was writing for Pākehā in this book. And it's really about, the book is really about saying, okay, decolonisation is not just for the tūturu staunch activist types that, you know, that are leading our protests. That's not just the mahi of them, it's actually the mahi of all of us, and it's the mahi of Pākehā. And so that was the kind of impetus for writing the book. And so it's so I guess in terms of what is decolonisation, that was the kaupapa of the act of writing the book in some ways, yeah.
This book is available for sale too, by the way, just down the back, just doing a little plug there. But I read it for the first time this week. Many of the writings in here are not unfamiliar to me. Stacey and I spoke about the trauma of learning te reo, the trauma of speaking te reo. Trauma is a byproduct of colonisation. Would you like to pick up on that at all? Paper, scissors, rock.
Yeah, I think trauma happens to us in a whole host of different ways. I think there is still this kind of desire, I think, to homogenise Māoriness and what it is to be Māori, despite the fact that Mason Jury has talked for years about diverse realities. And I think, I mean, people have said it before today, some of the trauma comes from our own being very harsh on each other. But the book is kind of, we tried to include little anecdotes, some of them, and they're pretty gentle anecdotes, right? We were trying to not blast people so that they were freaked out by the idea of decolonisation. But there's lots of trauma, even in the gentle stuff, right? And I think the problem with colonisation is that it's all the big stuff that we know about: loss of language, loss of whenua, that kind of stuff. But it remains pretty constant in the detail. So in the details of our workplaces, of our kura, all those kinds of things, of the way we interact in shops or whatever, the appropriation of Māoriness, all those things are quite in the detail, and so they're sort of quite hard to kind of put your finger on. But so we've tried to kind of elucidate some of that detail in the book. So, for example, one of the traumas that I had was being told we had to go around the room when I was at secondary school and Havelock North. If you know Havelock North, you'll know the kind of environment I was growing up in. And we were asked to tell what we wanted to do when we left home, and I said I wanted to be a lawyer. I mean, yeah, that was a kind of a kind of slightly crazy response. No, lawyers are right. But the teacher said to me, "Oh no. Māoris are good with their hands. Have you thought about making wooden puzzles?" And so I thought, you know, and even though it's kind of like it was a sort of moment in time, but it's just stuck in my head. And I imagine that many of you have those moments in time that are just stuck, and they're not big traumas, but you know, they're not kind of physical or whatever, but they're hugely kind of emotionally traumatic, and they yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, because it actually made me think of another kōrero that Moana Jackson spoke about, and he spoke about the two houses and that trauma and fear. Even when we talk about Pākehā Māori, there is that association with, well, if I'm, what if Māori want all their land back? And Māori are starting to regain their reo, golly gosh, what will that look like? So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the two houses concept that Moana, that you talk about in your segment in here, but also maybe break that down a little bit for our audience this afternoon, Mike.
Yeah, so Moana did this talk once where he talked about colonisation as like two houses. There's the Mauri house that has been established, and of course all the beautiful things that make up the Maori house, kapahaka, arts, all of those sorts of traditions, the language, the flavour, the smell, the look, all of those sorts of things. But the strength of any house is the foundations that it stands on. And so those foundations are things like the law and the education and the health system, the language, the stories, the philosophies that sort of give strength and meaning to that house. And when the colonisers arrived, then they built their house. And but when they arrived into this country, they had all of those traditions and all the beautiful things, the opera and the music and the ballet and the stories, but they had no foundations. And the process of colonisation was a process of de-establishing the Maori house and taking all of the foundations so that they all sit in the coloniser's house. So the house that we have is the house that you have in Te Papa. It just sits there, and it's beautiful and it's nice to look at, but it has no substance. It has no substance in it. And so the process of decolonisation is, in my mind, the rebuilding of the foundations of our house. And so, and today we see that in all kinds of areas. You know, you're correct. The stories that we've told are not new stories. I think that what we tried to do was to put it into, make it available or retell it in a different way. Because often we're telling these stories to amongst ourselves, and we're doing those things. We're trying to. Initially we were trying to write something that these 14 and 15-year-olds could pick up and read through it. We probably didn't make that, you know. It's probably still really boring, but anyway, that was the idea, that we wanted to move in that way. As I think Ocean's chapter, and you know, kei te mihi atu ki tō tātou rangatira a moana. Nāna tēnei kaupapa i kōkiri, nāna mātou i tautoko. And, you know, a part of Moana's role in this, you know, when we wrote it together, we all said, nobody's going to buy this except that it's got Moana's name on it. So, so that was probably our best move ever. But also Moana had an idea that these things need to be approached in all kinds of different ways. And so if the only thing was that we sat with him, and I mean, he challenged us in all kinds of different ways about the way that we were doing this work. And if he was able to replicate some of those things into our lives, then we felt that was he obviously thought that it was a worthwhile process, just sitting with us and going through these things. So, you know, he nui a mātou mihi atu ki aia. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe mai ki nā kai te tika wau nā kōrero, kai te tangi hotu tonu, te manawa, i tērā taniwha hikurua. Mātanga mātauranga, mātanga whakaro e pāna ki tēnei mea, e pānei kia tātou. Now, I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on a couple of kaupapa that you have in here. One of them is around what's in a name. And often what comes with that, especially as a teacher, or waimari e ahau, he ingoa Pākehā tōku ingoa tuatahi, engari ko tā te manaia a Hiranei, ko tā mātangi reia, ko rongo mai a niwa e rereke ana. So what's in a name? Can you perhaps talk to us a little bit about that?
Over the last recent years, then I was doing some whakapapa research in our own whānau, and I noticed that of the hundreds of names in that whakapapa book, there were very few repeats. And then we got down to our whakapapa on the arrival of Europeans, and there was a process where if you were baptised, then you would take a Christian name. And so, you know, an example is Wiremu Tamihana, he tō mātou rangatira nui i taua wā, ka huri ki te ao Karaitiana. And so he was given that name, and he also possessed his own name, so he became known as his original name, Tara Pipipi, ko ia tōna ingoa whānau. And then he became a Christian, so Wiremu Tamihana Tara Pipipi, and then it was the European Convention of adding the name of the father to the son, so Wiremu Tamihana Tara Pipipi Te Waharoa was his long name. And so we had that transition, and then we get to my mother's generation, where my grandparents named all their children Maori names, but then they, my grandparents didn't really go to school, but my parents and my aunties and uncles did. But when they arrived there, then some of those names were changed to suit non-Maori tongues. And so, I sort of tell the story about my aunt who arrived, and her name is Te Ao Marama. And she got to school, and the teacher said, I can't pronounce that, and decided to call her Maureen. And so, so she went home to her parents and said, oh yeah, the teacher is calling me Maureen. And the parents said, oh, okay. And that was her name. And so, so as she became more aware of these things, only when she was in her 50s, she says, oh, well, my parents gave me that name, I'm gonna claim that name. And so she started telling her, my name is Te Ao Marama. And, but interestingly, is our own whānau would still go, oh, that's Maureen, And, that we had sort of taken on those ideas about what's valid and what in a community would allow their children to be named by strangers.
Kei te rongoa hau I tērā, kei te rongoa hau I tērā. And actually, like, if I think back to even myself and my aunties, all of my mum's whānau have every single one of them have got Pākehā first names. And even my auntie who when she went to Whare Wānanga Waikato, and Timoti told her to use her Māori name, which is Aroha, I still call her Auntie Greta. Hey, and back here everyone knows her as Greta, and it's kind of one of those things. And yet, ka whakamana no, ki te whakamana no iaia, me whakaingoa I tōna ingoa Māori. Little things like that are part and parcel of what we are going through right now, as we try to deconstruct and reconstruct our way of being as Māori. So kei te rongoa hau I tērā mamai, and kāre kore kei te rongo koutou katoa I tērā. Oh, that stiff upper lip, because that's what Auntie Maureen or Auntie Te Ao Marama would have had to have done, the stiff upper lip. You talk about the stiff upper lip as well in your piece of writing.
Yeah, so I guess when I was saying before I wanted to write the book for Pākehā, and basically my Pākehā whānau, right? So I've grown up, as many of us have, with a Pākehā side and a Māori side, and I grew up within the community of my Pākehā relatives, and I think, through those years I've heard a few things from them, like, oh, haven't Māori had enough, things like that, or, but a couple of years ago, we did the Iron Māori, I think I did it with Maria, and there was a team, and my husband, who's from Britain, was the runner, and my brother was the cyclist, and my cousin, Pākehā cousin Claire, was the swimmer. And in Iron Māori, you get these, you put your iwi, and if you don't have an iwi, Pākehā or whatever. My cousin had put Pākehā as her iwi, and my Pākehā auntie saw this at the after party, and she said, oh, why have you, like, she's sort of angry at this kind of assertion of Pākehā-ness. And so she said, oh, aren't we all this, same old trope, aren't we all the same? And it just made me livid, and I was trying to work out why I felt so angry. And I think it was just that kind of diminishing of the fact that actually my experience in the world is different from my Pākehā cousins. Like I as a kid, I was a bit darker in the Hawke's Bay sun, and I used to get followed in chemists, you know, because they were worried I'd steal the sunglasses. And I've been accused of stealing in my adult life, and I was, you know, so things like that I don't think happen as often to Pākehā. And so what I wanted to write the book for my Pākehā whānau. I don't actually think they've read it, unfortunately, but to say, hey, you know, this is actually why colonisation's been really shit for you too. Like, it's not actually just been shit for Māori, it's been shit for you. And this has been my experience living in the world, and it's been different to yours. And so the way I got my mātauranga was by, as all good researchers should, I put out a question on Facebook saying, hey, what do you think? Why has colonisation been bad for Pākehā too? And I got back a whole host of answers. So my chapter focuses on all of these. And one of them is that an answer was around this idea that actually Pākehā must in some way experience some kind of intergenerational trauma. There is this strong kind of British thing about the stiff upper lip, about not showing emotion, and I see that very clearly in my Pākehā family, and that kind of repression of emotions and having to, you know, sort of look fine when you've severed ties with your motherland and your whatever, is quite a sort of, must have been quite a traumatic thing to go through, and Catherine Delahunty talks a little bit about that too. So.
Your whakaaro on the stiff upper lip, Mike, I'm curious.
I don't know if I have any whakaaro on that idea. Yeah,
Kei te pai. I'll talk a little bit about it. I'll grab the moment, because I find it really, really interesting. I'm expected as a local councillor to demonstrate a stiff upper lip when I'm clearly hearing racist overtones coming my way. We're accused constantly of being biased, and we're currently going through a moment in time, and I'm going to speak about it, because this is something that must stop. The stiff upper lip moment in time when we think that we cannot speak our truth must stop, because the moment we stop it, we actually start showing who we truly are. Kia Māori ai te ao. Kia Māori ai te ao. We all have a heart. That is what Māori is. Māori is having a heart. If you're sitting in this room, you have a heart because you've come here specifically to a Māori Writers Festival, because you have a heart and you have a yearning to speak your truth. So that's my little bit on the stiff upper lip. But anyway, back to decolonising, imagining decolonisation. Can you give us some more insights into some of our amazing writers, such as Amanda Thomas, such as Jenny Smeaton, such as Ocean Mercier, such as Moana Jackson, and just give our listeners and our audience here today some more. Many of them are picking up on your themes already, because it's not unforeign to us. This is a world in which we live in. We're confronted with this daily. We open the Daily Post and bang, smack on the front of our page. We see issues that are facing us, issues that sometimes result in, have been born out of poverty and deprivation.
I'll go first so Mike doesn't choose all the good ones. You can. No, I think, again, one of the things that, thinking back to your kōrero with Stacey just before, you know, sort of moving forward in terms of decolonisation is a little bit like moving forward in terms of te reo, it seems to me. So, you know, 30 minutes a day, that kind of styles. But I don't mean you kind of think about decolonisation for 30 minutes a day, but it is in the small acts. So I think sometimes we think it has to be a big protest or a, you know, another claim at the Waitangi Tribunal, or, you know, these big things. Of course, those are super important, right? We need those things to be kind of ground-breaking, ground-shifting acts that move our people forward. But actually, again, decolonisation can happen in the detail, in the everyday. And Amanda, in her chapter, actually talks from a Pākehā perspective, giving a whole host of kind of opportunities for Pākehā particularly to be good allies and to support the act of decolonisation without taking it over. That's her important kind of rounding out message of that chapter, that it has to be Māori led. But they're little things like saying to a colleague, oh, actually, could you not sit on that table, please? Christopher Luxon the other day, perhaps someone could have said, hey, can you not sit on that table, please? You know, little things like that. Or, oh, hold on, could we just hear from, you know, so-and-so, so that we get a sort of louder Māori voice in the room? Little things like that. And I think we could all be doing those really mini acts of decolonisation in our lives, and along with the big stuff. My daily interest in my new job is to how do we actually do it through our urban design and urban development, and that might be things like making space for Māori to be Māori in the urban environment. For example, at the moment you go around a city and you often find public barbecues, so we're exploring how do we give opportunities for people to have a public hangi in a public space, you know, or a umu or whatever. So little things like that, but again, you've got to be. There's such a sort of fine line, because there's an appropriative line, and there's a sort of tuturu genuine line, and in the built environment world, I call it the sexy brown. There's quite a lot of sexy brown going on, where people are quite keen to to kind of show the symbolism, but the fundamental shift in the way that we're thinking about the world is not happening.
I love it. Imagine some of our geothermal hangi pits all around Rotorua. Oh, heaven. Mitai, I know Mitai's in the body.
Oh, well, we wrote this book together as a group, and writing a book as a group is nice. It's a nice way to do things, and it's bouncing ideas off each other was really helpful in a really complex space. And the thing too is in doing, you know, we've done a few things, not like this Māori festival, but a few things where we've talked to like the secondary school teachers in Wellington and stuff, and different people have different backgrounds, and so Bianca and Jenny, who are really doing a whole bunch of stuff in Ngāti Toa in the education space, have been able to speak to that. Moana is was doing his thing, and then we're doing our thing, you know. So that communal writing thing, I reckon, is something that whānau writing is something we should, as Māori writers, think about as a thing to do. That we don't need to do the long, lonely stretch as individuals. So that's one thing on that writing. The system that we live in is fundamentally flawed, you know, and decolonise New Zealand is a better society for all. And so and that sort of comes through clearly with what Moana was saying. And so we try to focus on those big things. So people talk about, we can talk about the little things and making changes, but we need to make change, because if we're living in this society based on lies, it will come to its own head and we will be in trouble. So, there's things that we need to do. And part of what I was trying to say too was that in spite of all of the things that trying to assimilate Māori into all kinds of spaces, at every point Māori have said, I want to remain Māori. And so we're not talking about replacing white faces with brown faces in the same places. We're talking about structural change and changing our society, because it's not working for us. And so there's a whole lot of work that's being done by a whole bunch of people in education and in the legal system and all kinds of areas, you know, and so that's an important part. And then just the last thing is that sometimes we've had critique come back and say, well, shouldn't we be talking about indigenisation instead of colonisation? And as I was sort of thinking about this, and I haven't thought it through clearly enough, but I was thinking that, you know, it is a much positive approach for Māori to be thinking about re-indigenising our spaces. But Pākehā people can't re-indigenize our space. They need to decolonise that space, and so there's this. Maybe both those things need to happen, and both of them are positive statements when we're decolonising these other spaces, so that they discontinue those practices, and we re-indigenize our spaces to become more confident in the world that we see in front of us. So, kia ora tātou.
Kia Mauri ai te ao. Aye. Look, I'm sitting here in a little bit of awe, thinking about how else we traverse this conversation, because I think we've got so much. There's so much depth just sitting at this table, actually, when we start unpacking this word decolonisation or indigenisation, and so with that whakaaro, what are some of the other steps that, even if I draw on where Moana was going to, he's the last chapter in this particular book, where to next? Decolonisation and the stories in the land. Where to next for you, Rebecca?
Oh, Mike. You start this one, Mike. Moana talks a lot about stories in that chapter, and about realising our stories and making sure that they're up front and centre. And privileged, actually. The word privileged is so important in these conversations, because as people have talked about in relation to the reo, the Pākehā norms are privileged so much that Pākehā don't even know that they're the norm. So he actually, because as Mike was saying, we had lots of conversations about whether this is decolonisation or whether we talk about re-indigenisation. And interestingly, in my own work, re-indigenisation is more palatable. People don't want to hear the word decolonisation, but they're happy to hear the word re-indigenisation. But he actually, because at one point he was talking about re-Māorification. And but when we're having the discussions with him, he said, "Oh, actually, I've kind of started to dislike that term as well." And he was like, "What? Essentially, what he wants is the treaty to be respected and realised, and that has got to be in his mind underpinning of any kind of imagining of decolonisation." Another example around that is that Bridget Williams' books actually asked us if we'd do a second book that talked about examples of decolonisation. And Mike said, "Oh, it might be a bit like Rocky 2, which was like a bummer at the cinema." So we haven't actually done it. But Moana also was really a bit reticent to do it, because he said, "Well, the problem is that people will rest on their laurels, right? They'll kind of take they'll say, oh, well, we do a karakia now in our workplace, and so, you know, we're on the journey and we're sorted. And they'll rest on their laurels and they'll feel like, oh no, we've done our bit, without fully understanding the huge shift that people have to make for us to really see what decolonisation is. So we haven't done the book, and we'll never probably do the book. But I do think that we still just have to make people know, and I was talking to Chris earlier, make people understand and know and learn about what's happened, because people just don't know. They don't know to feel the mamae that we all feel, because we do know. So this new approach in terms of teaching history, I think, is one step along the journey at secondary school. But people are there's definitely a shift, right? People, you know, it's hard to get into the old lessons because there's so many pakia in those classes. And so we're kind of moving in the right direction. And I think just one more point and I'll shut up. But the reason why we've called it imagining is because we wanted a sort of hopeful orientation to all this, right? That hopefully actually we can get to something that's good. Because I think, and again, it stems back to some of the kōrero this morning around trauma. If we only sit in the trauma, it's really hard to move forward. So the Imagining Decolonised Cities, the sort of process behind that was a public urban design competition where we got people to imagine what a decolonised city might look like. So they gave us physical designs for Porirua, which to them, and they gave us a rationale, would give them a decolonised city. So yeah, hopeful and possible things. We need to be thinking about that, because it's very hard to imagine. It's very hard to move towards decolonisation if we don't have any examples of what that is.
Kia ora, Bex. Look, just picking up on some themes before I open it up for questions. So themes over this week, and I spoke about it briefly also when I interviewed Stacey. So it's around your vulnerability, it's around the resilience as well. It's also around how we move forward, kia Māori ai te ao, but within that need to happen conversations. Kei konei, kei wainga ia te aka Mauri, we're sitting in our Rotorua library. We have probably one of the best collections of Māori writers' books or Māori books here in the motu. I also do want to give a shout out to McLeod's, because they would have to be the #1 bookseller when it comes to Indigenous writings in the whole world. Kia ora refa, kia ora koutou. But I say that specifically because it is through our stories, it is through us telling it our way. The other theme that I wanted to pick up on, because Dr. Nepia Mahuika spoke about it out at Tarimano on Monday night, and he spoke about why did he write his book, a book that we can't get here in Aotearoa, and it costs a bomb apparently, but he wrote it for an American audience, a non-Māori audience. He wrote it specifically in that way because he wanted to get our story told right by Māori, telling our stories, which is exactly what this book, albeit not all Māori authors or writers, people from Aotearoa telling our story our way. And that is where the story starts, but it is not where the story ends. The story is one of revitalisation. We've been trying to do that with our reo. We've been trying to do that with our tikanga. But now it's actually just to do it because we want to Māori ai te ao. So in that, nei rā te mihi kia kōrua, I'm going to open it up for some questions now. We've got about 14 minutes for question time. And also if we've got anyone online, kia ora koutou, if we've got anyone online, do we have any questions from our audience this afternoon? Uncle Stu, tēnā koe, the mic is coming around to you.
Kia ora koutou, but Mercy, I thought it might be useful just for you to make a comment about the Te Arawa stories and the Ngāpamana wa e Waru and the contribution that's beginning to make right here in this library.
Tēnā koe, yes I will. So about four years ago, a project that I was a director of and leading out here was Ngāpu Manawa e Waru. As an opportunity to conclude the legacy of Ngā Pūmanawa e Waru, we still had money, and what we did was we brought together a collection of there are actually about 150 stories, but produced there are 60 stories that are in both te reo Pākehā, te reo Māori. They're only 300 words, but it was a way of providing our narratives, our way, specifically designed for our schools. It was an opportunity to allow our young readers to at any point go and have a look at this resource where they could learn about who they are and where they come from. Once again, reiterating the fact that it didn't matter if they were Māori or non-Māori. The fact of the matter is that these are still their stories. This tells of our heritage. So the library has now received that gift of this particular website, and will continue with that legacy because it is about growing that space. But it is the power of the stories that we get to tell it our way. And but that's once again for all of us to take on board. So ko tērā, ko te pūrākau, te pātaka pūrākau o te arawatira. Great Te Arawa stories. More to come. Pātai? These two. Thanks, Uncle Stu.
Awa, tuatahi ka mihi kia koutou. Nei rā te reo kaitahu o Ngāti Kahungunu hoki. E mihi atu ana i a koutou, me o koutou mahi aki aki, i a tātou katoa kia whai tērā pai tāwhiti, kia pua wai a popo. No reira tēnā koutou, me ngā kahapai katoa o ngā huihuinga o te wiki nei. Kia ora tātou. So I'm just looking outside at the clock tower here, and I'm thinking about the kōrero last night with Rangi Mātāmo about maramataka time. Yeah. Maramataka, not maramataka. So I wanted to ask, what do you guys think about that kōrero, that time is the biggest colonizer? Is it something that he's been saying? Yeah. Ngā mihi.
I wasn't at the kōrero last night, but yeah, I mean, I think, what do I think about that? The way we structure our society, which is revolves around time, it is definitely not our way of of seeing things. And I follow another wahine from up north who talks a lot about the maramataka, and I know that there's been kura and things that have started to reframe their when they do certain parts of the curriculum and things based on the maramataka, and it seems to make a lot of sense to me. I mean, Christmas Day is an arbitrary date anyway. It's not actually the date that Jesus was born, and so it's a sort of quite a strange, kind of strange sort of. I mean, it's basically we've just taken the sort of northern hemisphere's ways of structuring our year and so on to structure our own years, but it doesn't really make sense in the southern hemisphere. Yeah, the approach to sort of starting to rethink time and when the year starts and acknowledging matariki, I think is a really hopeful possibility for the country. I just wonder how we do that in a way that's really kind of genuine and not just about fireworks and so on. So that, yeah, that's my small response. I'm sorry, not a particularly.
With the here to Pātai, I could have had a go at that one. No, I won't. We'll chat offline, darling. Ka whai Tim. Te tia tu Pātai.
Kia ora te whānau. I think really tied to that question, because for me time is very much a tool of capitalism, you know, the 9 to 5. And you talked about the way the system is so broken, and to me that's the heart of the system. And every time I think about decolonisation, it crashes into capitalism. I have to, basically make money instead of decolonising. How do we navigate that? How do we reframe the system? Because they seem so closely tied together.
I'd be looking up for Moana right now.
I did write a little bit about capitalism and neoliberalism actually in that chapter, because one of the Facebook responses was around this, and it's a very clear collaboration between capitalism and colonisation, and I think people are starting to get pissed off with capitalism. Actually, I think there's starting, and in COVID, I think has ironically helped people kind of refresh and think, okay, what are the values that we want for a society, particularly when we've got such an uneven society generally, not taking into account the impact of colonisation on us. But Max Rashbrook's written a really good book called Too Much Money, which is eye-opening in terms of the sheer difference between rich and poor, the ways in which capital are tied to land, and of course land is tied to colonisation, and basically you make more money by having stuff than working is the thesis. I think the Piketty project talks a lot about that. So how do you respond to that? I think you respond to it by thinking about new ways of giving and receiving a resource. A papakainga is an obvious example of a way of sharing resource. In the Pākehā world, there's transition towns and things like that, which have been about kind of working on other types of economies, the donut economy, all these kinds of things. So I think there's things we can take from some of the Pākehā theory, but there's also stuff that are pretty much inherent in the way that we have lived in the past that we can be drawing on to create more equitable societies that aren't just focused on owning capital, but sharing resource, would be my quick answer.
For me, there's a decision that Maori people have to make as to whether they're going to commit time and energy in transforming or working within that system to break down and to move and to make change, or often that's been so difficult that Māori often choose to go the other way and go, let's re-establish something in this space and work from a set of values that might work for us. And both ways are difficult, but if you choose to go and work in that other area, you end up on council and that sort of area. But others are sort of going, well, I'm just going to go home and be with my whānau and do things there. It's a difficult thing that not everyone has the capacity to work in Pākehā structures to make change and to fight that battle. So it depends, in my mind, I'm much more towards the whānau leaning. So I feel like if I can establish things within my own whānau and hapu, then I feel happier and I feel grounded in that space. The other thing just seems like totally out of control, and I don't like the people, I don't like the structures, I don't want to live that way. And so, so these are just things I'm trying to think about, and we get involved in the struggle.
Tēnā kōrua te tehi atu pātai.
Tēnā anō koutou, o te rā kura, me tā kura whakatakoto I tēnei kaupapa. So I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about, especially having just finished my studies looking at my moriori hokopapa, and if we're talking about written word and how Indigenous stories can be mutilated, then I think ko tērā taha o tātou tētahi kua tino kitea. And so I guess my question through the kaupapa of decolonisation is, how do we move away from that, segregation and actually mend our relationships with other Indigenous people as well as our own people here in Aotearoa. So I guess any whakaaro that you might have of how we can start to approach that post the damages that colonisation does, I'd be really grateful. Ngā mihi.
One of the ways that we've tried to do it in the built environment world is we have a organisation called Ngāho, which is the Māori Designers Network that runs across the country, and we've been collaborating with First Nations people from Turtle Island and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and actually trying to kind of connect further afield. Is that what you mean? Yeah. And we actually, again, a sort of small act of decolonisation. There was a book being written called The Handbook of Contemporary Indigenous Architecture. And a few of us were asked to write in it, put our chapters in. I presumed the editors were Aboriginal, but turned out they weren't, because we all got an email from one of the Aboriginal architects who'd been also invited, saying, telling all of the invited writers to that the editors were both Pākehā Australians, or they're not called Pākehās, are they? But white Australians. And so we, and there'd been lots of kind of ethical issues. So this actually was a catalyst for working or getting together with my Aboriginal and First Nations colleagues, and we decided to pull all our papers and write our own book. And so we now are onto our third book in the series. It's a series called Our Voices, and it's only for Indigenous authors. So we're really staunch about that. And I'm not staunch about that in all spaces, because we've got Pākehā authors in this, but there has to be some space carved out just for Indigenous voice. And so that's one little act that we did to try to kind of create space, but it's also formed these amazing kind of relationships and repaired and able to share stories and compare notes and compare strategies for decolonisation and compare words, and is Indigenous the right word? It should be something else. So there's been all these kind of big conversations that have come out of it that have been really fruitful. So it's one example.
I'll probably finish that example off with #aroha, because we can't go far without having aroha in the mix, and it is with aroha that I will close our session this afternoon. And thank you both for sharing your vulnerability as well, because in writing, as we've heard over the week, it often takes us to a vulnerable space where we can actually write our own truth. So me mihi ka tika kia koutou. We've had the similar theme both through Stacey's and this particular presentation, where we've looked at ways in which we can indigenise and re-indigenise our spaces. So even with the question around how do we look at ways in which we heal our past relationships with Moriori, and the ways in which we move forward as Indigenous people in one land, that takes a lot of communication and wānanga. So I liked where that one went to, because not only did Stacey talk about how do we as Māori reinvigorate our reo, and how do we do that in a Māori safe space, we do that within our wānanga. Once again, these are potentially opportunities that we can, by being Indigenous, have wānanga with our Indigenous relatives, not other. Scrap that one. Heo noe te iwi, nei rā te mihi kauatu ki a koutou. Look forward to our next speaker, so I will hand it now over to Whaia Mākoha. Tēnā no tātou e te whare. Paki mai.
Immerse. Tēnā koe. Have a quick gulp of water. Dear, you're on next again, aren't you? Yes. I'm taking. Yes. Thank you. You are wondering, as I am, what my role is right now here, because we already have had the health and safety briefing. I have reminded you about the sponsors. I have talked about the products. Therefore, I do know that we do need to give Mercia an opportunity to have a drink of water before